Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's Xtalks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Knowledge Management in an R&D Environment, using an electronic lab notebook as a starting point. My name is Andrew Jordan and I'll be your Xtalks host for today. And a big thanks now to TECHNIA Transcat who helped develop the content for this presentation. TECHNIA Transcat is a global leading knowledge company within PLM. With offices all over the world, they are just as much of a global system integrator as a local partner. They have the awareness about the challenges in the life sciences industry, a constant search for new ways to reduce time to market, decrease launch time of new products, streamline processes, make the packaging process less complex, increase revenues and cut costs, and at the same time meet regulatory demands. TECHNIA Transcat's expertise is to help companies to drastically reduce product development costs and deliver products to market much faster than the competition while enabling you to meet regulatory compliance. They have 600 consultants that are experts in Innovia, CATIA, Simulia, BioVia, and Delmia, and have experience from working with over 5,000 clients worldwide. TECHNIA Transcat is part of the Adnode group listed at the NASDAQ OMX Nordic list. And now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. Matt Chilian has a long history of leading research informatics teams in pharma and biotech companies before joining BioVia. He is one of the architects behind the BioVia notebook system. And Nicholas Lindberg is a sales executive with over 20 years experience in sales and marketing. Based in Stockholm, Sweden, his work with TECHNIA Transcat includes helping their life sciences partners turn regulatory complexity into a competitive advantage. And now, it's with my pleasure to hand the microphone and the presentation over to our first speaker for today, and that's Nicholas Lindberg. Nicholas.
Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Nicholas, as you heard, and I work for TECHNIA Transcat, a company that paved the way for your innovation, creativity, and profitability. We combine industry-leading tools with specialist knowledge so that you can enjoy the journey from product concept to implementation. Our experience makes it possible to keep things simple, personal, and accessible, so that together we transform your vision into value. I'd like to welcome today's speaker, Mats Chilian from BioVia, Dassault Systems, a close partner to us. Mats has worked in life science R&D for many years in companies like Pharmacia, BioVitrum, Sobi, and is very familiar with the needs of the industry. He has also hands-on experience from contract research organizations that work in the pharma biotech ecosystem, where data need to be shared between organizations. One of the big problems is to understand what IT systems are needed and how they should work together. From TECHNIA Transcat, we often see customers working with product lifecycle management. There are several other systems, such as electronic lab notebooks, which fulfill other purposes. If we could make these work seamlessly with each other, the users would be happier, the companies would be more efficient. I hope that this webinar will give you some thoughts on how to start digitization, if you haven't done so yet, or how to extend the functionality if you already have some support systems in place. With that, I'll hand over to Mats.
Thank you, Niklas. Right, the topic of today, there are really two things. One is the knowledge management, which is obviously one of the biggest assets we have in life science, but not only in life science, but in other types of corporations where you have R&D. And the point that sometimes a starting point is the difficulty. How do you drive digitization of your business? And I will touch upon that first by describing what I say as the corporate access problem. We have lots of different data, we have lots of different needs in corporations, and there are different aspects of that. The second bullet is how you grow the informatics systems. As Niklas said, There are many different of them, and they need to coexist, and they need to connect. And how can you think when you have this big pie to slice? Collaboration and sharing is obviously the key aspect of knowledge management. This is what it's all about, really, isn't it? You have to use everybody's knowledge, and you have to share that within the company. The fourth bullet is really hands-on. How do you go about to implement? How can you do it? How quickly can you do it? And as an illustration, I will bring up a customer story from a few years back with one of our customers, a big, and interestingly enough, as I was alluding to, I've been working in life science, pharma, my entire career, basically. But R&D is R&D. So I think we should be aware of that although that might be the focus industry, this is applicable also in consumer packaged goods, for instance, in energy, in high tech sometimes. So sometimes maybe people think that ELNs is only about life science, but that's not true. A few words about Biovia. It is one brand within Dassault Systèmes, and it was actually formed when Axeleris was acquired a few years back, and Axeleris has a very long history in science and scientific software and quality. And Axeleris in turn has been formed by a number of companies, of which this product that I'm working with now is part of that. And we are nothing more than our customers. And we have, as you may see on the bottom left of the slide, a number of very different customers on our list, including Pfizer, for instance, but also Shell, Unilever, and so forth. So the corporate access problem, what is that? I have to say I'm sometimes surprised when we talk to customers around the world, how many actually lack a common system for keeping and sharing information around R&D activities. You'll think that by this 2018, that would be common goods, but that's not true. And one of the first questions is really, if you have paper notebooks as the primary way to document what you do out in the labs, then you have to have a problem. Obviously, because you have no real corporate control. You cannot see, even if you want to, what people scribble down in their books. They are not searchable. You don't know if people are compliant. You hope that they are, but in reality, it's very, very tough to find out. And books go missing and are not handed in, and people may have big gaps, and so forth. So that's kind of the first question. What's the standard? What systems do you use? The second bit is how incredibly hard it seems to be to agree on standards. Pharma industry is in a constant change, and you have mergers and acquisitions, and you buy things and you sell things, and you have a number of systems which you need to somehow harmonize. In particular, when it comes to structured data, assay results, measurements, which are more typically stuck in silos, more a rule than an exception. On the same note, even common vocabularies are hard to agree on and to implement, and that makes it even harder. And this means that to be able to extract critical information from these unconnected systems can be very, very challenging. And there are a number of cases where this is actually extremely crucial for the business to do that, and in a finite time. One interesting aspect, but not so fun to handle, is that often there is a low trust in corporate IT projects. Users have sometimes been there, seen that. Some, including myself, remember the big LIMS projects back in the 90s that usually were badly scoped and didn't really work in reality. And it is a top-down rather than bottom-up process. So many users ask, what's coming now? Is this really for us? The consequences are quite clear. there are many quality issues that you have notes that you cannot read. You can have glued in material and the glue has been dried and you have missing signatures, and you simply don't know if people are recording what they should record. Which means that from an intellectual property patent protection point of view, you can have big holes here. You hope that your most valuable assets are properly handled. And when you really scratch on the surface, you see that they are not. And if you have a patent litigation case, this can really be fatal, especially when you need to bring out information within a very short time frame. To dig in people's drawers is virtually impossible. The last bullet is probably the most problematic because it is a cultural thing. If data are perceived as private rather than corporate, then it sort of hampers the idea of sharing with others. You get the culture of, I'm the only one that can interpret my data. And this is actually a common theme until you've broken the ice. And I think that this might be the single most significant aspect of introducing electronic lab notebooks across the board, that suddenly people realize the value of sharing. And once you've done that, the rest, the more complicated things, might be easier actually. The sharing has two entirely different aspects to it. Corporations should favor sharing because you grow the corporate knowledge base. It's the collected know-how. At the same time, obviously, there's a need for business reasons to restrict access. So you have a dilemma. How much should be common and searchable and across a global corporation typically, and how much should be restricted? And here, and we find that we see this over and over again. My message is try to find a reasonable default. If you dig down into the extremes, you say that no, but there are cases that we really can't, we must be secret. Sure, there are, absolutely. But try to say these ones are okay, but then we have some exceptions. So encourage the sharing, but accept that there are limitations. That is a working principle. If you say we only give people access on a need-to-know basis, then you have sort of missed the point with building up the knowledge, and you will be more restrictive than you probably need because you cannot manage that. What is a need-to-know thing? Who decides? And to do that continuously is a very tough nut to crack. So remember the purpose. We want to build knowledge, and so we need to share information.
All right, and now it's time for a polling question. Thanks very much for that, Matt. That polling question is up on your screens right now, and you can vote on this in real time by clicking on any of the options there. So the question we have for you, do you currently have an electronic lab notebook system in place? Your options here, yes, no, or maybe it's under investigation right now. Do you currently have an electronic lab notebook system in place? Looks like most of you are voting on this. Thanks everyone for doing so. You can get your last clicks in now because I'll be closing this poll in a few moments and then sharing the results with everyone. All right, I think I'll close that now, and let's take a look at the results. 50% of you saying yes, 33% saying no, and 17% of you are currently investigating that. Interesting. Thanks everyone for voting on that. And with that, I'll hand the mic back to you.
Thank you. So, growing informatics systems. First of all, in a typical R&D organization, we have lots of different systems, and they have different purpose. VLNs, where you jot down experimental observations to prove your inventorship and to find out what really happened during the experiment. You may have document management systems to store technical reports. You may have databases for assay data, numeric data, screening data, things like this. You may have SDMS systems. You may have sample management systems. You may have LIMS systems. You may have systems to request things to be done, like an analysis. And you may have a PLM system. And obviously, you need many of those. One thing is that when we get requests for an ELN system, it's tempting to say that ELN represents everything that you don't have. So you're looking for something really big that can do everything for you in one go. And that is not such a brilliant idea. And I'll try to elaborate a little bit why that is. So with this definition, which, and to be fair, there isn't really one. Where is the boundary between an ELN system and a sample management system, for instance? You can say, why not incorporate them? Why not having one kind of composite system? And sure, you can. But you have a landscape which is built from different life cycles, different vendors, different technologies. And they will live side by side. To have one system that fits everything is not realistic. You have some legacy things that you have to have. So you really have some components that you have to consider. To try to integrate them through data rather than the applications is preferred, because if you have some changes and you have maybe thick clients and you have web clients and you have SOAP and you have REST and you have whatnot, that can be very, very hard, and you can get into a deadlock situation where you really can't upgrade anything because the house of cards will fall. So focus on the metadata and use that to connect the system. Of course, that's a simplification. You have to have some glue. You probably need to write some little applications that transfer data, for instance, between systems. And of course, if you have modern RESTful APIs, that makes it easier, no doubt. But at the same time, there will be systems that don't have any RESTful API, and you have to handle them. We have a little toolbox called Pipeline Pilot, which could be very helpful. There are probably more of those, but there's a graphical user interface, and you can build pipes where data can go and in an ETL process sort of be transferred from one system to the other. I'm coming back to that as an example eventually. The key here, though, is the metadata. And this is an example from life science. Most life science companies have some protein targets. If you're fighting diabetes, there might be PI3 kinase or PTP1B or whatever kind of protein target. You have obviously constructs, genetic constructs that correspond to these proteins, and you have protein batches created from those constructs, and you may test compounds against those proteins that you have in the assays for binding or for some kind of activity. And all these are obviously related. And if you want to have one system where you, for instance, register compounds and another where you select what assays you want to run, then they need to communicate. And this is done through the metadata. If you do this right, you can not only find your stuff, which is the primary thing, but you can also say, hey, if I got these compounds that were active against this protein target, then maybe we should test them against this other protein target as well, either because we want to, that they should be active, or that we really don't want them to be active at all. So it is kind of a way how you build up the knowledge. And it's not really that complicated if you think about it. These examples come from life science, but you can think about in a CPG corporation where you have formulations, for instance. If you have detergents, or you have washing powder, or if you have toothpaste, or if you have ice cream or whatnot, then you have a similar thing. You have dependencies between the different components that you work with, and all the logic, how they connect, is actually critical to finding stuff and understanding what you got. And this is, of course, one aspect is the ability for you to not to repeat things. The other one is how you quickly can create new variants by finding what you've done already. So these are highly structured data, but they are metadata that can also live then. So you can have one, if you want to, typically people have materials in some ERP system, right? So you have SAP or something. Fine, that's okay. But it may be so that you want to have the compounds or assays or proteins in some other system. So if you use this consistently, you can allow tracking and integration between the systems. If you go back a little bit to large organizations and the challenges we have here, we can have a wide variety of disciplines. We can have requirements from drug discovery to regulated development. We can have lots of different workflows, different business units, dependencies on systems and vendors that I was discussing before. We may even have incomplete or conflicting roadmaps, which means that the expectations when you want to build out a system like this can be very, very different. And so if you have, and which is very, very typical, you have a lack of global metadata. Many companies don't even have a common nomenclature for projects, and even less so for systems or entities like plasmids or proteins. And it is hard to agree on standards. So how do you start? A consequence of this is that you cannot have a big bang. It simply doesn't work. There are too many variables, too many unknowns. You have to gradually deploy and let the organization mature so you gradually become more digitized. One lesson that we have learned is that if you have very specific things, instrument, workflow specific things, handle them separately from the core ELN project. There are always some specific reason to have specific things for a specific corner of your universe, but try to see the commonality first. An interesting thing that we see always when we get a request for proposal from customers is that your specification before the deployment, what is really needed, changes. So you think that these three items are the most important thing, while in reality, if you have been running the system for some time, that will shift. The 80-20 rule I found extremely useful, and in this interpretation is try to get 80% of the users happy first. And then, so you don't let the remaining 20% jeopardize the entire thing. All the complex, icky things, you will handle them at some point, but not initially. This leads us to a very kind of sketchy but architecture, which I just to show the principle. The strong point with an ELN system, and in this case, the example is BioVia Notebook, is that it's common to all scientists. It is the platform with which you can easily share information, reach out, regardless of where you sit on the globe and what project you work in. It gives you a confidence that this is for you. You work with it 8 hours a day, and you see that it makes your life easier. It's easy to be compliant. It's easy to kind of jot down what you do, easy to copy paste chromatograms things into this, so you get a workforce which see the value of sharing and the value of the systems. Connected to it, and I would say that this is probably, and I've said it before, a key component. You need to have some way to handle the master data, to have common identifiers for key objects, like protein batches, like plasmids, like antibodies, or whatever you're working with. And this can be a standalone, or it can be part of a PLM system, and both work fine. But there needs to be a central place. Then you have various systems, and if you go down and say, okay, we need to have something more specific than just the commonality of that the notebook can provide. We have certain areas where you really have systems that we need to connect. And then you can have, for instance, Pipeline Pilot, where you write scripts that performs data transformation connections to HPLC systems or screening systems or what you have. And they can change over time. They can come from different vendors, but you have a very kind of loose connectivity. That means that you can adapt to these. It's not a static thing. And really, some of these systems are used by only certain groups, only certain sites. And that's fine. That's okay. And the same thing, obviously, is regarding the PLM system part, which can have a well-carved out purpose, and it can connect to other systems in turn, which have nothing to do with the notebook per se. But as a common landscape, it makes sense. And here you can change one part without all of the rest just falling into pieces. And we have another poll question.
That's right, we do. That polling question now is appearing on your screen. And again, you can vote on this in real time by clicking on the options there. This is our second and final polling question of the day. Do you currently have a product lifecycle management system in place? Your options, just yes, no, or maybe that's under investigation for you right now. Do you currently have a PLM system in place? Looks like most of you, again, are voting on this. Thanks, everyone, for doing so. You can get your last clicks in right now because I'll be closing this poll in a moment and then sharing the results. And let's do that right now. I'll close that poll. And here we are. 50% of you saying no. 33% saying yes, and 17% of you, again, under investigation for that. Interesting. Thanks, everyone, for voting on the second and final polling question. And with that, Mats, I'll hand the mic back to you.
Thank you. So, a little discussion about collaboration and sharing. There are no monolithic organizations, if there have ever been any. You have an ecosystem of suppliers with contract research organizations, universities, and it is a dilemma that the infrastructure is typically very monolithic, but the collaborations aren't. And it's hard to drill holes in the firewall and open up corporate systems for partners. What I've encountered over the years is that document sharing platforms are widely used. You can have sites and you have third-party providers and you can share documents and that's okay for reports. But really, if you want to extend your R&D with more hands and more talent outside, you want the transparency. You want to see at an experimental level what people are doing in real time. And that is very, very hard to do with a kind of time frame of reporting. We have seen that we ship the BioVar notebook on a cloud solution as well. So small biotechs and universities and small groups typically have the multi-tenant environment as their ELN. And to use this as the common ground looks very, very promising. It means that you can essentially have your own system behind your firewall, and then you have your partners outside, and you can cherry pick and see what people are doing. The nice thing is that you don't need to do anything. You don't need to have even a discussion with your central corporate IT. You can start a group, you can invite the users, and you have full access to the contract research organization data, and you can see what they're doing for compliance and other reasons. Really, here technology is of course interesting. If the notebook is built, if the cloud is built on a modern architecture with a RESTful API, then you can of course fetch the data and insert them into your corporate system, which may be a completely different system, of course, as part of the data transfer. It can look something like this. You can have different groups, you can have partners, you can have university collaborations, you can have a partner biotech, and you essentially only have a member in the mothership, in the pharma company, into each of those groups. And when you say, I want we've reached a milestone, I want to get to all the records from the contract research organization, then you do so. And you import that when needed. So very, very lightweight, but very, very efficient compared to the the minimal investment, I would say. And in particular, that you don't have to make it a huge infrastructure project. You can simply set up this from scratch. So I really urge you to look at this as a way to form your ecosystem, especially when partners come and go. You may have a collaboration for 3, 4, 5 months, and then you close it down. And this is a subscription model. You can buy those 3 months and then you're done. Period. It's interesting that when I started the ELN journey, probably 15 years ago or so, the cloud was not really invented, and during many years the mentality was that you have to have your data behind your firewall. You have to have your own servers. I have to say that only within the last 2 or 3 years, this has changed dramatically. Even large corporations now say that cloud first is the way we're going to go. And I think that we will see in many different corporations that the going to cloud will be a fundamental change. And we have many coming now who say that they are not only interested in that, they are not at all interested in other solutions. Which also, from this point of view, from the technical integration point of view, means that you can't have duct tape and glue so much. You have to have interfaces if you want to transfer data. So we are really forced to build those APIs for transferring stuff. Yeah. So how do you do it? How do you deploy? And this is an example. There are obviously lots of ELNs out there, but the deployment is a critical phase. And this will be an example how you can do this so it actually applies. Typically, first you run a proof of concept. If the requirement is, and as I said, it has usually been that you should run it on premise, you typically test it. You set up everything, you get corporate IT on board, you spin up the servers, and you have 20, 30, 40, 50 users running this real life for a few months. You really ensure that the core team and the user, kind of super users here, are on board. During this time, you need to work with access model and configuration. This is new to many, because if you haven't shared anything, you haven't been encountering the problems of sharing and making the decisions about who should see what and when. Then you can expand the pilot. You can involve more business units. You set up the infrastructure. You create standard operating procedures. You may have an internal support and training for this. You need to check with records management how they work with this new system, and you finalize the access model and scale it up to, say, 300 users. Now you know that things work. You have a penetration into the different parts of the corporation, into different business units, into different sites, and then you can go into full rollout with thousands or more users in production mode with corporate service, IT, everything in place. Then you can extend the scope. You can run proof of concepts with integrations, with other systems, with LIMS, with whatnot. And the driver here, make the users happy first, because they will be your best friend. They will help you doing the complex, complicated issues where you need to work out and agree on things and standards and things. But it's much easier when you see that you have a momentum. This relates exactly to a customer story. It was a large, in this case, it was actually a large consumer packaged goods company, one of the leaders in the world. They saw the ELN as a part of a global digital initiative. They had realized that the ELN would probably be the largest productivity gain from the kind of corporate perspective. They had an PLM in place. They had been looking for a light notebook that can be rolled out very broadly for some time, but not found very much. The requirements was that it must scale to at least 4,000 or 5,000 users. It must be easy to use because the rollout need to be relatively quick, yet possible to validate. They are running basically under the same requirements as a pharma company, biotech company. Very strong legal, very strong QA requirements. They had, interestingly, this, I think that many customers have tried this several times. They had tried other systems, typically an in-house development based on SharePoint, and people found it clunky, and it was sort of not really resolving the problems of the scientists, of the technicians, but it was something where you needed to create some record and upload it, and then you possibly maybe could find it again. But it wasn't really as easy, so you can use it 8 hours per day in all the different labs. So what happened was that there was it was a funny story. It was a very clear turning point where we demoed the system over WebEx for the core team in December. And then since we have the cloud, they made a trial. They saw the core team saw that it worked. They started on just mid-December, and that had actually looked okay. They started the pilot project planning, roughly as I described before. And in March, there was a decision to go for a 220 user pilot, and all the contracts were signed. Then came in April the implementation phase, integrating with LDAP, setting up the access model, writing the validation scripts, followed by validation, vendor audit, and end of June, the pilot was launched on-site, plus some WebEx user training. And at that point, they got 220 users across 5 sites running by Notebook. So in roughly 7 months, from the kind of first demo to go live. And I have to say that for a company of this size, this is extremely impressive. What happened after that test, and that was a pretty substantial test with a few hundred users, user comments was, after using ELN, I will never go back to the paper lab notebook versions anymore. Very user-friendly, self-intuitive. This is the first time in 1.5 years in the company that I have an updated lab notebook, which is also interesting. You hope that what you have is okay, but in reality, you have big holes where you're not compliant. Best ELN tool I've ever seen, and I've seen almost all. And from that, you had an internal drive. You had a group of users who were advocates who say, this is good. You didn't need to push this down to people's throats. So it was a very easy decision to continue with a global rollout in December the same year. Out of the box, low risk, 95% of the pilot users recommended to continue. They made some changes. They got a new service. They got an internal training and support set up. They have a distributed administration, and they launched their production in May with 5,000 users over different continents. And here, to add 4,500 users in 8 months, and having the strong business impact, at the end, in the assessment, they realized that the ELN was actually more valued than they even expected, and their expectations were pretty high in the first place. And then they are now continuing with other informatics projects. So it's kind of a nice story, but I don't think it's particularly unique, maybe unique in terms of scale, but the idea to take the simpler things first and to wait with the more complex, I think that has proven right many, many times. So, a summary. Removing paper is important. It is important for IP protection, for quality and knowledge sharing. It's interesting, people sometimes try to make kind of estimates on the return of investment. And this is, and I think you should, but the problem is to determine what's your current state. How good or bad or fragile is your current state? Do you know anything about how people record things? Do you know how exposed you are for instance, a patent litigation? And the answer is that usually not. People don't even want to know. But I bet if you made a kind of true comparison, if you picked people's notebooks from their drawers, then you would kind of see what problem you have. Deploying electronic notebooks has proven successful. You really get a platform for further systems integration. You get acceptance for sharing. Here, the scope is of course critical. If you have the corporation behind you, it's recommended. You can grow it from single groups, but the problem is that sometimes you get hijacked by some specific group's needs, and then you sort of miss the point, the global knowledge management point. And then you connect to other systems gradually. And last, to use cloud as a collaboration platform first, absolutely. Very lean way for checking your outsourced activities. Eventually, I think it's fair to say that the cloud will be the preferred choice for most corporations, in fact.
Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Again, a special thanks to our speakers for today, Nicholas Lindberg and Matt Chilian. We hope that you found this webinar informative today. Have a great day, everyone.